was born into a family with a bipolar alcoholic mother, and it was filled with a lot of violence, and that initially taught me how to dissociate and detach and seek refuge in ways that I could. So eventually I tried to figure out what's going on, and it drew me to therapy, and I discovered the defense of dissociation. And I also discovered how alcohol and drugs had been used as a form of dissociation, if you will. And in pursuing my education, just trying to figure out what is going on, and I had many suicide attempts as a kid, and really was kind of living desperately. But fortunately, the Lord led me to certain people who guided me, and long story short, I wound up working in a prison as I was finishing my doctorate, and I discovered that it was a drug rehab prison, and I discovered that there, but for the grace of God, go I. And it only reinforced the notion that people dissociate in various ways, prominent ways, through their addiction, whether it's pornography, food, drugs, and alcohol. And then moral injury, I kind of, just as I think of PTSD, how it has been formalized, moral injury is the same thing. I mean, when people are coping with a trauma, if you will, and they use substance, which is a very common form of solution, they do things that they would not otherwise do. And all you have to do is look at the Ten Commandments, stealing, lying, adultery. These are forms of moral injury. And so in some measure, you can't deal with, there's a real connection between trauma, addiction, and moral injury. And the other recent diagnosis that they've come up with is complex PTSD, where they've discovered that individuals who may have initially entered into treatment through their trauma in war, it touched a nerve that dealt with developmental trauma, which is what we now call more complex PTSD. So, that's how I kind of wound up here, and it's a short story.
So I love the little graph that Dr. Moon kind of put together. I've not seen anything like that, so I definitely took a picture of it because I want to utilize some of that and some of the things that I do. I also want to add one thing to that, and Liz and Katz also talk about this too as well, and that's betrayal. But here's the most important part of this, because oftentimes betrayal can come in the form of betrayal to a unit member, to command, but also sometimes betrayal can feel like, I've been betrayed by God. I've been betrayed by my higher power. So, with that being said, since betrayal is a very key piece to this, what do you feel how do you deal with betrayal on the multiple levels that cause that moral injury? I'll start with you, Dr. G.
Well, I was very angry at God. Why did you put me in this situation? And I had a very kind of bipolar relationship. And what I'm sharing about myself is very common of those that I work with. Anger at God, betrayal. Why was I put in this position? I was just a kid. And then to discover that there is the love of the Father. Yes. And the Father I never had, really. Never felt His love. And so it was a process of coming to, and I've been sober 37 years, and I really give a lot of credit to initially the 12-step program for sure, and but there is that anger of betrayal, And I think that it's a common theme in complex PTSD, as well as betrayal of, when you're serving in the military, of betrayal, and I could relate to the prominent betrayal that an MST survivor feels, who is typically betrayed by his or her command in dealing with the disclosure of the event. 9 out of 10 times the command basically compromises the individual even further.
Yeah, so I think that this is actually a really important question. I mean, it's, to me, the biggest lie that human beings tell themselves, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is that we're separate from God. We're separate from each other. We're separate from nature, right? Like, that's the biggest lie that we tell ourselves. And I know that that lie is going on, right, when I'm in a shame spiral, when I have all this stuff going on, because I feel alone. And when I feel alone, I'm forgetting, right, my true nature, the truth of who I am with a capital T, which is, I'm a child of God. Lowercase c is that I'm Madeline Jackson, Director of Clinical Services at the Hero Program of Opelousas, right? So both are true, but I have to remember the big T. And when I'm dealing with moral injury, I can forget that, and I have to, go back to that. But in order to remember the big T, I also have to go through the betrayals that I feel from my higher power or God. For those of us who grew up in dysfunctional homes, I remember as a child, I was not an atheist when I got sober. I had a relationship with something, and that brought refuge in insanity. I had the internal drive to want to connect to something, because that just, everything I was learning about God sounded so much better than what I was experiencing at home. But at a certain point, it became too much, and I didn't understand, why am I in this situation? If God loved me, why am I here? And, for a lot of us who struggle with addiction or other issues, right, that became the pseudo-spiritual experience. It mimicked the spiritual experience in the sense that it allowed me to kind of disconnect from all the negative and be able to feel comfortable in my own body. I mean, that's really what a spiritual experience allows me to do when I have the real thing. It just remains there. And I think that dealing with veterans too, or anyone with trauma on some level, right? It's the question of why did this happen? Why am I experiencing this? And really not having the answers to those questions. And then when we really have to start learning about spirituality, at least the guys coming in, working the 12 steps, looking at 2, came to believe that a power greater than myself made a decision to turn my life over to this. It's hard to do when you have a lot of pain and you don't know why it happened. It must be because of this thing outside of me that is punishing me, or doesn't like me, or doesn't love me. And so we have to wade through those questions. And it starts with baby steps, because it's kind of like, well, how do you get somebody from one extreme to be able to start believing? And a lot of times it's through the connections with other human beings. Right? Because they can say, well, I believe in something. I have faith that if I share my story, I'm going to get relief from that. Okay, that is turning something over to the process. Right? So you have to start small with some of that stuff. And you also, right, I've noticed with people coming in with certain religious beliefs, they have this idea that they're going to be punished for questioning God, which means that they're not honest with themselves about some resentment and betrayal issues that they have, because they've been taught that you can't question things, you just have to accept it. Yet that's a big reason why they remain disconnected and why they keep using. I mean, addicts, and I would even say veterans, right, who struggle with suicidality, they die over not addressing these spiritual wounds. That's why people lose their lives in the business that I'm in. And so it's also really important, right, that the clinicians, my clinicians, me, who are teaching these things, is that we have to demonstrate those things. So sometimes people start believing not because of what I'm saying, but because of what my actions are showing. You know, like if I'm demonstrating that I'm a trustworthy person and that I'm explaining what makes me trustworthy today is my connection, people start to pay attention to that. So I think that it's a really important issue that has to be looked at, because I don't think, you know, you're going to hit a plateau with trauma work. You're going to hit a plateau with moral injury work, any type of self-reflection work, if you're not willing to go there and really look at these spiritual issues. You know, I can know everything about my trauma. You know, I can know what my triggers are, why they exist, and all of that. But the change is not going to happen if I don't get connected to something that goes deeper than the level of thought. And so it's more than just learning about yourself. It's learning about yourself and then learning to trust in this spiritual process. And that block or that barrier there sometimes is that betrayal. And also self-betrayal. You know, every time, and it's also looking at, okay, if I may have this betrayal that I put towards God, and that's what I use to abandon things. You know, every time I put a substance in my body, I'm betraying myself. You know, this trauma experience may have happened 20 years ago, but I've been harming myself for the last 20 years because I have not resolved this one. And it can be overwhelming sometimes when you start to look at that. You know, how could I let this happen to myself?